Well, hello everyone. I've been told I have a signature move. Maybe I won't have to do it. If you can hear me, clap once. Hey, all right, excellent. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Kristen City, and I am the CEO of Habitat for Humanity in Minnesota, and we are just thrilled that you are all here.
Good afternoon, evening. Ooh, we are moving into the evening hour. It's great. My name is Makia Griffin. I am the Executive Director of Rondo Community Land Trust, and I serve as the Board Chair of the Minnesota CLT Coalition. Woo, right? Do we? Woo-woo! Ow, ow, ow! I love it. Every time I get a mic, I do want to sing, but I'm not going to do that tonight. First of all, I really want to thank our sponsors. I think some of them are listed here, which is great. The Minnesota Community Land Trust Coalition, Habitat Minnesota, and the Housing Partnership are all pleased to be co-sponsoring today's keynote speaker event with Dr. Jenny Schuetz. The Community Land Trust Coalition is hosting our annual Community Land Trust conference this week. We got 3 days, awesome. So it started today, so thank you if you're part of the CLT Coalition conference, thank you for attending. Bringing the keynote speaker and having her address us tonight was really in part of learning and connecting this week. And today's event is free for everyone due to our wonderful sponsors. So I want to take a moment to thank Alaris, Bell Bank, Bremer Bank, Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, Huntington Bank, Housing First Minnesota, Minnesota Housing, Old National Bank, U.S. Bank, and Wells Fargo. We'd like to thank them for their support for us to be able to co-host and bring this wonderful event to everyone and have that free. So thank you, and let's just give everybody a round of applause.
That's great. Thanks again. And all three organizations, Habitat Minnesota, Minnesota Housing Partnership, and the Minnesota Coalition for Community Land Trust, we're just really thankful to be working together on this event because we care deeply about building a thriving, affordable housing ecosystem in Minnesota, particularly because we want everyone to have safe, stable, and affordable place to call home. Before we get too far along, we'd like to recognize that our event space is Native owned, and we gather today on the traditional land of the Dakota and Ojibwa people. We honor and give thanks to the indigenous custodians of the land throughout what we call North America and Minnesota, acknowledging that their forced removal and displacement from the land has caused and continues to cause immense suffering throughout their generations. We recognize the continuing connection of indigenous peoples to their land, water, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge that we are gathering today during a time of global unease. And our vision at Habitat for Humanity is a world where everyone has a decent place to live. And I think we can all collectively agree that that vision isn't being lived out today in our current environment. So I just want to note that we pray that collectively in this room that we may use our power to create a world that's more loving, just, and peaceful. One of our key values at Habitat Minnesota is bringing community together to advance the mission of creating more affordable housing in our communities, and this event is one way that we do that. I'm excited to see so many of you. We love that this room is full of people who care deeply about this topic, affordable housing, and that you're excited about talking about what some policy wonks might call zoning reform or those types of topics, particularly when the Twins are playing their third game today. So thanks for being here to have this conversation. And I particularly think it's important, Minnesota Housing Partnership just released their 2023 state housing profile this past March. And it demonstrated the need for our continued work and emphasis on this topic, with more than 590,000 Minnesotans being cost burdened, and those impacts being felt disproportionately amongst Black Minnesotans, Minnesotan seniors, and low-income Minnesotans, combined with our state having one of the nation's worst gaps between white households and Black households in homeownership. We know that we have to keep moving our work forward to create more affordable, stable housing in our communities. As the team and I began planning today's event, we talked about some of the barriers to building more affordable housing in our state. And in addition to needing more resources, the constant theme that came up was not in my backyard efforts. I'm sure many of you have faced NIMBYism in your work. When we began researching who might be able to talk about ways to work through that barrier, Dr. Jenny Schuetz rose to the top. Her approach to repairing America's broken housing system is well-researched and thoughtful, and she offers practical solutions that can be implemented and put into practice. I know we're all here because we can talk about this topic for hours, theorizing, thinking through policy, big picture ideas. What I've enjoyed about Dr. Schuetz's approach is her ability to take theory and put it into practice. I'm looking forward to hearing from her today and how her work may impact the state of housing in our great state of Minnesota. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce both Dr. Schuetz and our moderator, Danielle Duncan. First, Dr. Schuetz is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro and is the author of Fixer Upper: How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, the PBS NewsHour, and The Atlantic. Before joining Brookings, Jenny worked on the board at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and taught at the University of Southern California. She currently teaches in Georgetown's urban planning program. Jenny earned a PhD in policy from Harvard University, a master's in city planning from MIT, and a BA with highest distinction in economics and political and social thought from the University of Virginia. Following Dr. Schuetz's keynote address, Danielle Duncan will moderate a discussion that includes some prepared questions and the opportunity for you to ask your questions. As questions occur to you today, please use the back of the program you received when you arrived to jot them down. We'll have time for a few questions further along as we wrap up today. So, Danielle Duncan is the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity and a Habitat for Humanity Minnesota board member. She has spent her 20-plus career as a public servant, working and volunteering in a variety of capacities aimed at ensuring individuals, families, and communities at risk reach the levers needed to fully participate in society. A Chicago native, Danielle's warm personality and matter-of-fact approach brings people together, leading to teams' new strength and the clarity to tackle personal, social, and business challenges that arise when we embrace and invest in diversity holistically and authentically. In addition to her credentials as a facilitator and intercultural development inventory qualified administrator, Danielle earned cum laude honors in psychology from Augsburg University and her MBA at the Carlson School of Management. Thank you, Danielle and Jenny, for joining us today. Now, please help me welcome Dr. Jenny Schuetz to the stage.
Thanks for that kind introduction, and it's lovely to be here. I always love having an opportunity to come to the Twin Cities. I appreciate that you held off on the snow until after I'm gone. Today was a gorgeous day outside, and it's always wonderful to get to talk to other people who are deeply in the world of affordable housing and who are committed to the cause of making housing more affordable and abundant for everyone. I'd like to start off by reminding us of sort of the big picture while we're all here. For those of you who are not familiar with the ins and outs of New York state politics, this is Jimmy McMillan. He is the head of the Rent is Too Damn High party. New York is one of those wonderful states where you have single issue parties, and this seems like a particularly resonant one. Even in the rest of the country, though, outside of places like New York, it's also true that the rent is too damn high, the prices are too damn high, and too many people struggle to find affordable housing in a community where they have access to opportunity. Now, if we step back and look at sort of the national picture and take the long historical view, we can understand one of the big contributors, which is simply that the US hasn't built enough homes to keep up with demand created by population and job growth. So for the past 30 years, we've been trending downwards, building fewer homes per capita than we used to do. And this really came to a crisis point during the great financial crisis. We stopped building homes altogether for a number of years, and then very, very slowly started creeping back up to pre-crisis levels. But effectively, we are 3.8 million homes short across the country. This is not spread equally in places with particularly strong job markets, places like California, Seattle, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., where I live. Those metro areas haven't built enough homes for more like 30 to 40 years. So we have cut off supply in the places people most want to live. The rest of the country is unfortunately getting tighter as well, and so virtually all parts of the country at this point need more homes just to accommodate the people who live here now, let alone growth moving forwards into the future. It's not just about the total number of homes, and this isn't just a result of sort of market forces. This is very much a reflection of the rules that we have chosen to impose on ourselves as communities. We have made it difficult to build anything except single-family detached homes on most of the land. Not just in our small towns and suburbs, but even in major cities, more than 2/3 of the land is zoned to allow only a single-family detached home. So if you think about what that means in terms of how we use our land, we have lots of land per house and have often run out of space to add more housing, right? This is just a geometry problem. Neighborhoods that were built in the 50s and 60s with single-family homes are at the capacity that's allowed under zoning. We can't even add things like townhouses or duplexes or small apartment buildings that would allow us to bring more people into these communities. We have lots of examples in our existing older communities pre-zoning of the kinds of really beautiful structures that fit into our neighborhoods. Sixplexes like this one, fourplexes, row houses, and particularly in cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia, not just that you can build small houses close together, but these very skinny homes that are really an efficient use of land that work well for both ownership and for rental, that accommodate households at lots of stages of their life and their career. We also used to be better about building houses and neighborhoods serving retail and services close to one another so that people could do things like go to the grocery store and get a cup of coffee and drop off their kids at school within an easy walk of where they live. In addition to prohibiting small, efficient homes, our zoning now also prohibits neighborhoods serving retail in most of our residential communities, even though we know many people would like to live in a community where they can walk to basic services. Instead, what our zoning allows is very uniform development, single-family detached homes, identical sized homes on identical sized pieces of land, 2-car off-street garages so that we have room for our cars as well, identical setbacks. All of the dimensions of our homes are very carefully prescribed, which then yields neighborhoods where there's no diversity in the housing type, and that makes it also very hard to accommodate a diverse population living in our neighborhoods. So you can imagine if all of the homes are the same size and built at the same time, they're all gonna have basically the same price point, which means that to gain entry to many of these communities, you have to be able to buy a single-family detached house to live in. Not only is this going to be more expensive, this actually isn't a great fit for the households who make up a majority of our population. We adopted a lot of these zoning rules at a time when homes with children were the predominant household type, but today the fastest growing household type is the single person household, many of whom are older adults who in fact can't maintain a big single family house with an external yard. Younger households before they have kids also prefer to have a smaller space closer to things. So we have this mismatch not only in price, but in the type of structures that people want to live in. I've been talking about the kinds of rules that we write about the size of homes that get built, but it's also important to think about the political process that governs housing development. So any of you who are in the housing development business or who are active in your communities know this is a political process. Local governments write the rules around housing production. They have also chosen to defer heavily to people who already live in the community and essentially give them veto power over what gets built or doesn't get built. So if you go to a community meeting and a developer wants to replace a surface parking lot with an apartment building, people will show up and say, I don't want apartments, it's too big, it will destroy the neighborhood character, this takes away from the open space that we have, this cuts down the tree canopy. There's a long litany of excuses, but at the end of the day, people who live in the community can stop development they don't want, and very often that's any development or any change at all. This is all true for market rate housing. Those of you who are in the affordable housing space know it gets even worse when we want to build subsidized housing or income restricted housing for low income families. The political process is more difficult, the excuses proliferate. It's just harder and more expensive to build homes for people who need them the most. So all of the stuff I've been talking about so far is really about the overall supply of housing and the diversity in types of homes we build. There's a separate affordability problem as well, which is that low-income households everywhere in the country don't have enough income to pay for decent quality housing and have enough for other necessities. The poorest 20-25% of households spend more than half of their income every month to pay the rent or the mortgage. That leaves them too little to pay for food and transportation and healthcare. This is true not just in expensive places, but in smaller communities, rural communities, even cities like Detroit and Baltimore that objectively have a lot of homes and a lot of vacant housing, but poor families still can't afford to live there without some additional help. The easiest and most direct way to help them afford decent quality housing is simply to give people money, whether that's through housing vouchers or a universal basic income or a child tax credit. Just give people more money so that they can pay for the things that they need. The flip side of, absolutely. The flip side of not having built enough homes where people want to live is that we have built and continue to build a lot of our homes in places that we shouldn't be building at all from a climate perspective. And this is becoming more clear every day if you read the headlines and see that major insurance companies in California and Florida and Hawaii are pulling out of the business altogether. We have built a lot of homes in very risky areas and in areas where people have big carbon footprints. They have to drive everywhere. They have big homes that use a lot of energy. From a climate perspective, we need to rethink where we are building homes, both to make people safer in where they live and to slow the rate of climate change going forward. I don't need to tell those of you who are in the Twin Cities that homeownership is also a key part of the racial wealth gap. So we know that the US has had a number of different barriers to homeownership for Black and Latino households going back over the decades. The result of that is that today, more than 70% of white households own their own home, fewer than half of Black and Latino households do, and Black and Latino homeowners have less home equity built up than white households do. Now, this is very much a reflection of many, many decades of intentional legal discrimination followed by illegal but still ongoing discrimination in housing markets and mortgage markets. It's important to recognize that even if we get rid of the barriers to homeownership today, that this racial wealth gap has accumulated over generations. Young white adults, when they buy their first home, are likely to get a gift for the down payment from their parents or grandparents. Young Black and Latino households do not because their parents and grandparents were excluded for homeownership and were not themselves able to build up wealth and then pass that along. So even if we eliminate the gap in homeownership rates, entry into homeownership, that racial wealth gap that's accumulated over generations is going to take more aggressive intervention and something like a wealth transfer to provide for families who have been excluded from this mechanism. It's also important to recognize that zoning plays a role today in reinforcing racial and economic segregation that have been created over decades by different policies. Certainly those of you in the Twin Cities area are familiar with the role of the redlining maps that excluded Black and Latino neighborhoods from getting access to capital. Those redlining maps are gone, but zoning plays a lot of the same roles today. The neighborhoods that were greenlit for mortgages and that got capital and got investments in public services over the decades, today those neighborhoods only allow large single-family detached homes, so technically Black and Latino households can move in as long as they can afford to buy maybe $1 million house, right? That's not really a very high hurdle. It's also important to recognize that a lot of this is going to continue in other forms. If we get rid of zoning barriers, other things like environmental reviews, historic preservation, discretionary processes will still come up to block access to many of these neighborhoods. And so we need to think about what's coming next and get out in front of that. Local governments play such an important role in determining what gets built, and it's important to remember that they have their own interests involved in this. Not only are they reflecting the views of their constituents, but this matters a lot for their fiscal concerns. Local governments rely heavily on property taxes to pay for things like K-12 schools, transportation, parks, and libraries. And so they tend to do this sort of calculation in their heads when there's a proposal for new development. If they allow large, expensive homes, a 1% property tax will bring in more revenue per house than on smaller, less expensive homes, such as apartments. So very often they have this picture in their head, big, expensive houses bring in more money. The flip side is big, expensive houses also tend to bring in families with kids who go to school, whereas a lot of the smaller apartments actually place less of a burden on local fiscal demands, both for things like school systems and for basic services like water and sewer facilities. So this is an education process that we want to do with our local governments to help them understand, and also understand the consequences of excluding people who are not able to buy into the community. So we've had a real sea change in the last 5 or 6 years, recognizing that the local rules of development have spillover effects on our communities, our regions, states, even the national economy. By imposing these restrictions on new development, we are holding back economic growth. We're limiting the ability of people to move to high opportunity communities, whether that's a neighborhood within their metro or to another city where they could take on a new job. In order to fix all of these problems, we're going to need systemic policy changes at every level of government. Local governments who write the rules around development need to change those rules and allow a greater diversity of housing types at a wider range of price points, both for ownership and for rental. State governments have a still emerging role. They can do particularly useful things about incentivizing local governments to change their zoning rules using a mixture of fiscal carrots and sticks. And importantly, state governments can also help offset the infrastructure costs of building additional housing, particularly in smaller places that have real infrastructure needs. The single most important thing the federal government could do would be to provide more assistance for low-income households. This is a national problem, and only the federal government has deep enough pockets to help all of our poor families afford decent quality housing. I don't expect Congress is going to double the voucher budget anytime in the near future, but keep calling your representatives and asking for it. The main obstacle to having better housing outcomes isn't that we don't know what kinds of policies to pass, it's that the politics around getting these policies passed are really, really difficult. I don't need to tell you this, you all are involved with your communities, you know the level of political opposition that shows up to every single project, let alone to ambitious statewide policies. But there's reason for hope. Over the last several years, we've seen two really encouraging trends. One is the growth of grassroots organizations pushing their elected officials for more housing, for more affordable housing, and for better policies. In the Twin Cities, Neighbors for More Neighbors was instrumental behind pushing for the Minneapolis 2040 plan, and they have been a great example to other nonprofit groups across the country. We now have a proliferation across many of the cities and states in the country of groups that are organizing to push back against the YIMBYs, asking for more housing and making this a politically salient issue for a lot of local and state elected officials. State governments are increasingly leaning into this, either as Minnesota has done with more funding for affordable housing, or in the case of a number of other states, doing statewide zoning reform, making it easier to build smaller and more diverse homes in more communities. I wrote this book not as much for you, the faithful, but for people who are not deeply embedded in the housing world. These are really complicated issues, and a lot of our elected officials and a lot of voters just don't put all of the pieces together. They don't understand why our current policies don't work. And so this is hopefully a way to give you some talking points when you go into your next meeting to be able to say, look, the systems that we have economic costs, they have social costs, they have environmental costs. We can all be better off if we move towards better policies, and let's talk about ways that we can make this work better for everyone. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
So as Kristen said, there will be a time for Q&A for people to ask questions, but I have a few prepared questions. So thank you, Jenny, for that talk. Habitat for Humanity's mission focuses on breaking the cycle of generational poverty and closing the racial home ownership and wealth gap through affordable home ownership. We talk regularly about the impact of affordable home ownership, and your book notes that it's one of our nation's key way for wealth creation. You also discuss the need for alternative wealth building options to expand access to asset creation to a broader community. Can you highlight or expand on your ideas or innovations you've seen that could have similar generational impacts that home ownership has had on wealth creation?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because we're so used to thinking of homeownership as being the primary way that middle-class families especially build wealth. You buy a house with a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, you pay it down and build up this nest egg over time. But of course, you have to be able to qualify for the mortgage and you have to have the money for the down payment to get in initially. And often what we've done actually is focus on getting people to build up enough savings that they can make that down payment, but then when they get in the house, they don't have any money left over. So I would like us to think about flexible ways for people, both renters and homeowners, to accumulate liquid pools of assets they can tap into. So for renters to be able to save money so that for instance, you write your rent check to your landlord and some of it automatically goes into a savings account that just sits there and accumulates. Maybe you use that for a down payment, maybe you use that when your car breaks down or to go back to school, but there's a pot of money there that you can tap into. For homeowners, this is also really important because it turns out when you buy the house, then you have to spend the money on the house, things break and need to be fixed. And so helping homeowners also maintain essentially capital reserves, the way landlords do, to be able to tap into that. Making this as easy as possible so people don't have to stop and think every month, I'm putting aside savings, but using this forced savings mechanism like homeownership that just automatically goes into a pot, but that you have to think about then reaching into that to pay for other things.
Thank you. As you think about the folks in this room, many of them focus on affordable home ownership. What could you share with us that may help us expand our work and our efforts so many more people and communities can access this launching pad of affordable home ownership?
Right now is such a hard time to think about getting people into first-time home ownership for all of the reasons. Rent levels are really high, and so people don't have enough money after they pay the rent to put aside savings and build up their down payment. Lots of people have debt, credit card debt or car loans that eat away at their ability to save up money for the future. We also know that some people have difficulty with their credit scores qualifying for a loan, and of course at the moment interest rates are extremely high, and so the monthly mortgage payments are really high. Some of those are things that we can do something about and some of them aren't. Interest rates, none of us in this room control or can predict particularly well, and so we're kind of gonna have to wait for that to come down. Certainly organizations like Habitat and CDFIs are working on how can we have lower interest rates for first-time homeowners. A lot of the great groups that do homeownership counseling help people put together a budget to think about saving money and how to build up their credit score so they'll qualify. Those are all really great efforts and we should continue doing them. But also, to be honest, at the moment, we're gonna have to wait a little bit for the market to help us out, both with lower overall cost of living and rents, and particularly waiting for interest rates to come down.
So my next question is about zoning reform. You recently co-authored an article, Passing Pro-Housing Legislation is Only the First Step in Making Housing More Affordable, where you discuss how state governments across the country are making policy changes designed to boost housing production and improve affordability, but are learning that that pathway to implementation is long. So here in Minnesota, several groups are looking at the recent zoning and regulatory reform happening around the country in states like Montana and Oregon. Are there any policy strategies that you think would be particularly successful in Minnesota based on what you know about our state?
Yeah, so there are two kind of approaches that I think Minnesota should be considering. One is something a little bit like Massachusetts, which recently passed a transit-oriented communities law. So Massachusetts has a network of both subway and commuter rail and high-frequency bus lines around Greater Boston, and a lot of those transit stations are surrounded by really low-density housing. So you might have a commuter rail station that can get you into downtown Boston half an hour, but it's surrounded by single-family homes on 2-acre lots, and nobody can live in walking distance of the train station. So the state has tried to push localities with these commuter rail stations and transit stations to allow apartments just within walking distance. That's something that could work really well in the Twin Cities and in areas that have good transit. You guys have actually built a lot of apartments near transit, so you may not have as many low-hanging fruit, but that's a good one to pursue, and especially thinking about some of your bus rapid transit lines. The other thing is to make it easier to build smaller homes, either small single-family detached or townhouses throughout the community. So, rather than focusing, I would say, on something like duplexes or ADUs, which we don't really do in large scale, something like a townhouse that makes very efficient use of land, but that builders know how to build and can do at scale and can add a lot of housing that's still in keeping with the neighborhood community. So those would be two different avenues, and that's something that could be potentially explored statewide. I'll say also it's really important to provide support to your local governments when they're asked to do a zoning rewrite. They don't necessarily know which rules to tweak and how to get this right, and so for the state to provide some guidance and technical assistance will increase the chances that the statewide law actually takes effect.
Thank you. And speaking of trying to get it right, and what should we keep in mind when creating or passing state level policy to make sure we get the implementation across the state right? Very loaded.
Yes. Keep it as simple as possible. Figure out what your high-level goals are, and then focus on doing those. Don't try to get everything right the first time, because it's really hard. Make sure that you're monitoring the rollout, touching base with your communities to see how it's working, touching base with your affordable housing developers and your market rate housing developers to see whether this works or not. This is new territory for all of the states that are doing this, and so there's a lot of learning going on. That's perfectly fine, and that's okay. So going into this with just a couple of attainable goals and then working hard to make sure you meet those, know that you're going to have to go back and make some revisions, but make this as straightforward and as transparent as you possibly can.
You've highlighted Minneapolis's 2040 plan in your book as a way to have moderate density increases in cities, and today you've touched on how it was recently overturned because of concerns over the environment. The environmental review process is important when we think about climate change and its impact on communities. And Minnesota isn't immune from those impacts. Just this past summer, we've had severe drought, wildfires, and floods within a span of 5 months. In cases where the environmental review process is being used to slow projects down or even eliminate them, we're thinking about how we can manage the tension between building and creating more affordable housing. What environmental review solutions could we explore to help us balance the need to build more homes faster and the goal to minimize the environmental impacts of the building creates?
Yeah, this is a really sort of inherent tension in the way we've created environmental review. We focus on the immediate impacts around a project that is proposed. So a developer wants to build an apartment building or a new subdivision. What's the impact on local traffic flows or noise or migratory birds, just as a for instance, from that project in that particular location? But the review process isn't designed to think about the broader environmental impacts. So we know from a lot of the climate science work that infill development, building more homes in areas that already have infrastructure, that are walkable, that don't require cars, where homes are smaller and more energy efficient, that's the best kind of development we can do for the climate. Building lots and lots of subdivisions out into the exurbs indefinitely is terrible for the climate. So we should try to make it easier to do infill development and think about, if you don't build an apartment building on top of a surface parking lot, does that apartment building just never get built? Those homes don't exist at all. More likely, those homes are going to get built as larger homes that require people to use cars and drives farther out in the suburbs. But that's not the calculation that their environmental review does. It's just what's the impact of that apartment building on the half-mile perimeter around it. So I wish that we would make our environmental reviews more conscious of the larger regional impacts and state impacts, and recognize that our current development patterns are in fact terrible. I don't know exactly how you do this and sort of deter people from suing projects that are actually very climate friendly. One of my favorite examples is in California. Their State Environmental Quality Act has been used to sue protected bike lanes, which somehow are bad for climate. I don't even know what the logic is, but that tells you how broadly these laws can be written.
So what are some building and zoning practices that will help build more climate resilient communities and homes?
Infill development is the best solution in the long run, and we need to make that easier to do. We definitely need to think more about the resilience aspect of our housing too. The US has a lot of really old homes, which were built under previous building codes. Many of them aren't energy efficient, and they're also not particularly safe. So for instance, basement apartments in areas that now have rising water tables and more flooding areas. So we need to think about how we can retrofit our existing homes. Most Americans live in existing homes, and we just haven't grappled with the scale of the problem of doing those climate resilient retrofits.
Minnesota is very familiar with the impact of investor-owned properties on the extraction of community wealth. An investor recently listed many properties, with many of them located in North Minneapolis, at a time when interest rates are high and access to affordable capital is low for affordable home ownership like us, and the first-time home buyers that are in the market. Last legislative session, there was a proposed bill that would have restricted the investor ownership of single-family homes being converted to rental units to work through the issue. In your work, what solutions or innovations have you seen that could support a balanced approach in managing overinvestment in portfolio of single-family homes for rent?
This is a really difficult one to get right. So first of all, recognizing that investors buy single-family homes in part because we're not building enough housing, and they view this as, you're buying up a resource for which there's not going to be a lot of new supply as competition, and so the returns on this as an investment are really good, right? Investors want to own homes for the same reason that families do. Making these less of a good investment to investors is one of the longer-term solutions. In practice, it's really hard to limit who can buy particular kinds of homes. So we worry about, for instance, some of the big private equity firms that have not been good landlords. They don't maintain properties well, they're not responsive to their tenants. But private equity companies aren't the only ones who are bad landlords. And if what we're concerned about is the landlord's behavior to their tenants, that's something we should be addressing across all landlords, including smaller mom and pop landlords, and in some cases, even some of the public entities that own subsidized housing. We want to enforce good landlord-tenant law, clear communications, good building quality across all of the entities. It's really hard to limit the ability of a particular kind of legal structure to buy things, right? So institutional investors are not just the private equity firms, they're companies that have been building and owning rental housing for 50 years and do a good job. A lot of the investors are actually individuals and families who own a couple of properties, but they create an LLC to own this. So in practice, writing the legislation to say big bad private equity can't buy investment properties without restricting, say, smaller family-owned real estate companies is just going to be very hard to do. So I would say, I think we should focus more on making sure there's enough housing available, making sure that all landlords treat their tenants well, and that we're providing decent quality housing.
Thank you for that. This is the last question. Mobilizing around complex housing strategies. So housing is unaffordable in communities across the state. Minnesota simply doesn't have enough homes, owner-occupied or rental, and we are facing a major supply shortage of more than 100,000 homes that are affordable in Minnesota. While the issue is becoming clear, we know that the solutions may be more complicated to communicate. In fact, you start your book by talking about how housing sits at the intersection of several complex systems. We know that meaningful systems change happens through mobilization of our communities and working in coalition. What advice do you have for people in this room, full of housing advocates here, and experts as they communicate some of the very complex housing strategies and solutions to the general public?
Yeah. These are really tough questions and conversations to have, but some of the most effective conversations are person to person with people you know. So it's one thing to have people like me talking in large public audiences, but it's actually more effective often when you are talking to your neighbors or to your colleagues. We know that there's often a generational gap in sort of understanding the cost of housing, so talking to your parents and grandparents at the Thanksgiving table about why these kinds of policy changes are really important. It's also, those of us who sort of all agree and are on the same page, it's important for us to meet people where they are. So going into a room full of long-term homeowners and saying, you guys just don't get it and you're a bunch of NIMBYs and you're out to destroy the younger generation is probably not going to change people's minds. So starting off with, I understand that you love your neighborhood, I love my neighborhood, we're attached to the places we live, but there are real consequences to this. Talking about your own struggles, paying the rent and finding a place to live, and explaining what this means not to be able to buy a home in the neighborhood where you currently live and want to put down roots. So the person-to-person conversations are sometimes hard to have, but those are also really effective.
Thank you. I think we'll take questions. Chad.
Thank you, Kristen. My name's Chad Dittman. I'm Land Development Director at Twin Cities Habitat. And we have a project in a suburb here. It goes by the same name as a big lake in the west, where we faced a lot of opposition. We had, the Housing Justice Center write a letter to the city. And when we gave it to the city, we said we're not planning to sue you, but if we were, this is what we'd say. And it was an argument under the Fair Housing Act concerning disparate impact. And I'm wondering if you have any recommendations on how to operationalize the Supreme Court decisions that have occurred on that law for ownership housing. This is a group of ownership housing providers. And I think a lot of the cases have been around rental housing and just kind of a different conversation, but it sure would be nice to be able to refer that law without having to threaten to sue cities and get them mad at you and all that kind of stuff.
So I'll start with the caveat that I am not a lawyer. There are probably some in the room who would know this. I find it incredibly frustrating that we have a federal fair housing law that apparently can't be used to just rule exclusionary zoning unconstitutional and get it over with. I would love if we could do that. But I think the problem is that there are protected classes under the fair housing law. Race is a protected class, income is not. So it's completely legal to discriminate against poor people, and that's what cities are doing. Blocking rental housing, blocking entry-level homeownership housing, blocking affordable housing is discrimination against poor people, but the Supreme Court says so far that that's okay to do. If any fair housing lawyers know how to change that, we should try.
The low-income housing tax credit is the way we build most of our affordable housing. Unfortunately, it's not affordable to the most extremely low-income households. What do we do to build the scale, get to scale of addressing the needs of this population?
It gets harder and harder to build new construction for households as we go farther down the income scale, and it's true. I mean, the federal government has essentially stopped building housing for very poor people. We have really limited numbers of public housing units that are available. A lot of them are not in particularly good condition. Housing authorities that are doing some of the RAD conversions are expanding the supply of units that they control, and in many cases also expanding the livable lifespan of the existing units. LIHTC is just never going to reach really poor people. Absent a very large federal subsidy in a different form than what we have, this is not a problem we're going to be able to solve. And cities and states and communities are not going to be able to do this either. I would love to see more investment in deeply affordable housing, but that's going to have to come with direct match from Congress. So I think this is another one where call your representatives and tell them at the very minimum that we need to keep reinvesting in the existing public housing units and think about ways for housing authorities that have the capacity to do new development and want to add to their stock should be able to do that, which is currently it's difficult. They have RAD and that's about the only tool that's available.
Hi all, my name is Grace. I work for the Atlanta Land Trust. I'm a millennial renter. Something that I hear a lot in Atlanta, and I recently graduated from planning school in the Harvard Year in Review Housing. Talks about, it's like 40 pages. The first 35 are about we have this supply gap, and then the last paragraph is like, in 30 to 40 years, all the boomers are going to die. And sorry to be crass. But, Gen Z is the smallest generation. We have this aging population. And, if we spend the next 2 decades making up for what wasn't built in the last 30 to 40 years, what happens when the population changes in a different, the last sentence in the article was like, we need to increase population, we need to do policy changes to make people have more babies, right? Like this kind of wild logic of fitting the population to meet housing supply, but also having the housing supply meet the population. And it just seems really, like, how do we make this conversation relevant to the need that absolutely exists today, but also thoughtful about how the world is going to change, how our communities are going to change, and so that we're prepared for that version of the world as well?
Yeah, there's some complicated feedback loops between housing availability and costs and population growth and demographics. We know that when housing is expensive and hard to come by, that people at very least delay getting married and having kids, and that families have fewer kids than they would like because they can't afford a place to raise a family, right? So, in part, our population growth rate is slowing because housing is expensive. If we made housing more abundant, at least some people would choose to have more kids or have them sooner. There's a huge mismatch between our existing housing stock and our population characteristics and the age distribution. We actually, often in cities, people will complain, well, we're not building enough family-sized housing. We build all of these studio and one-bedroom apartments. Where are families supposed to live? We actually have a ton of family-sized housing. It's just occupied by 1- and 2-person households. So there are a lot of empty nesters who are living in 5-bedroom houses with empty bedrooms and a bunch of families with young kids who are squeezed into 2-bedroom apartments. That is politically a really hard one to solve, right? So like a pure economist would say, well, why don't we tax the value of, tax extra bedrooms, and then a bunch of old people will have to move out of their big houses and it frees up space for younger households. And I'm pretty sure no mayor is ever gonna say that out loud. That said, we actually do need to worry about the fact that there are a lot of older households living in 5-bedroom houses with stairs and with maintenance needs that they can't maintain. So we need to be making it easier for people to right size at all stages of their life, for families with kids to move into a bigger space, for people who don't need the extra bedrooms to move into something that's accessible and affordable and in their community and allows them to keep their social networks. This is one of the arguments I'd like us to use about why we should build more apartments. Building elevator apartments that are accessible in neighborhoods that have a bunch of older adults would let people move into a different unit and stay in their community, right? And we should be doing a lot more of that in order both to free up housing, but also to make it safer for people to live.
Hello, good evening, Dr. Schuetz and everybody. My name is Lark Washington. I'm with the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust in Richmond, Virginia. And I was wondering the impacts of abolishing single-family zoning on development. We are not anywhere close to that in Virginia, but I know Minneapolis, you guys did this a few years ago, so I was just wondering what does that huge zoning reform look like development-wise?
Yeah, so I should flip back to the slides where I was showing all of the kinds of housing that we used to be able to build before zoning made it illegal. The sixplex is in the Fan in Richmond. So Richmond is one of my favorite cities that has a ton of missing middle, but it's not missing in the older parts of the city, it's just missing from what we build newly. So, you know, I try to avoid saying in single family zoning, because the way zoning works, it lists the things that you're allowed to build. So ending single family zoning really means adding more structure types to the table of allowed uses, if we're going to get super technical about it. So I would love to take the table of allowed uses that says single family and add onto it duplexes, row houses, fourplexes, sixplexes, apartment buildings, right? Whatever we want to add on to that. And I think this is the conversation communities should be having. What are the kinds of housing that we used to build that already exist in our communities that are illegal under zoning today? If that sixplex burned down, you couldn't rebuild it because it's illegal under zoning today. Why is that? Why can't we re-legalize the stuff that's already there and then expand the places where we can build stuff? We already know what this looks like. These are some of our most beloved neighborhoods. Let's make it legal to build the stuff that we used to build and just expand the range of that.
Okay, so my wheels in my brain were spinning when Chad was speaking. And as you pointed out, it is legal to discriminate, but not to discriminate against protected classes. Can we tie income into familiarity statuses so that it is illegal? Just wondering. That was my thought when you said that, you know, because you pointed out income, but it is illegal with familiarity statuses, and maybe we can tie it to that. Secondly, not in my backyard, but some of my colleagues went to an NTI in San Francisco, and shortly after they returned, the hotel was closed down for safety issues because of homelessness. And so if we don't address the issue, as we see right here in downtown St. Paul, the Dorothy Day shelters, that eventually is going to impact our communities whether we like it or not. So which lens are we going to take? Housing, as Habitat says, my philosophy is it is a right for all and it should not be a privilege for some. So that is my thought. How can we combat some of these issues in these meetings where they're saying not in my backyard? Maybe the lens is showing the benefit, how it is a benefit to the community, because eventually crime will be outrageous and it will affect your home regardless if you welcome people or not. But if they're a member of the community, they're more stabilized, so therefore you kind of have a little bit more control versus people just wandering around that have no access to housing. And so that's just my thought. It really wasn't a question, but just to put that out in the room, so.
Yeah, I mean, the fair housing stuff, it's really frustrating, first of all, that we can't broaden some of the protected classes and just, you know, point out that discriminating against poor people also winds up discriminating by race, by ethnicity. I mean, we know that single mothers with kids are frequently discriminated against in transactions. Landlords do not want to rent to single moms with kids, and they often just don't, right? That's illegal, but proving that that's what they're doing is hard, right? We have to do audit studies and send out testers to say, you know, and then proving that they're turning down a tenant's application because it's a single mom with kids, or because it's a Black family, or because it's a Native family. It's very hard to do that. It's especially hard in really tight rental markets. You have 20 people applying for every apartment, only one family is gonna get it, and then saying, well, why did you turn down the other 19? It's incredibly frustrating, and I would love for us to come up with better solutions to doing this and more resources behind enforcement. I mean, the fair housing law has never been adequately funded for enforcement. In terms of homelessness, it's I think a couple of people have mentioned that you've read the book Homelessness is a Housing Problem by Greg Colburn. That's a really just simple, clear framing of the problem. We have homeless people because people can't afford a place to live, and until we make enough places for people to live, we will continue to see more people falling into homelessness, right? The places like California and Seattle, we're getting some homeless people off of the streets into supportive housing, into long-term housing, but more people are becoming homeless faster than we can get the homeless housed. And that's an issue of housing costs and affordability, right? Cities like Houston have done a great job at reducing their unsheltered homeless because they have apartments to move people into, right? So that's an essential part of the solution, along with funding for particularly the services and operation, right? Often the money comes to build supportive housing, but not to operate it. And what's the point of building it if you don't have staff and you can't keep staff working in the building? That's going to be sort of the crunch part of this. Zoning reform can do a lot. Making it easier to build SROs, making it easier to build very small efficiency units would make it easier to. I get really frustrated listening to community meetings where people who are comfortably housed say, you can't possibly build apartments that don't have windows in the bedroom, or underground apartments that have skylights, or small apartments, tiny apartments. Those are terrible. We should never allow people to live in tiny apartments. And my thought is, you're living in a nice house in a nice neighborhood and you can afford to pay for the mortgage. How do you know that you wouldn't prefer a tiny apartment without a window to sleeping on a park bench, right? So if homeless people don't want to live in those units, that's up to them, but you shouldn't be able to veto housing that somebody else might want to live in.
Hi, my name is Shannon Dotson. I live in Minneapolis in the Whittier Alliance Housing Committee. So a recent Ezra Klein interview, you talked about how in other countries, like a huge percentage, like Germany, they're renters and they have public housing. And so other than higher income taxes, if they don't have property taxes, how do they afford their schools and everything without property taxes?
Yeah, so there are lots of great examples that we can learn from other countries. Germany is a majority renter country, although it's about as rich as the US is. And part of it is that they've basically flipped around the way the mortgage interest deduction works. In the US, you get to deduct the interest on your mortgage from the house that you live in, so owner-occupied housing. In Germany, you can only take tax deduction for the interest on a mortgage of a property that you rent out to somebody else. So it incentivizes homeowners to create something like an ADU, live in the ADU, and rent out the main part of their house to someone else. And particularly, we see a lot of this with older homeowners who create a smaller apartment that they live in, and then they get income from the rental unit and they get the tax benefits. That's a really nice trick. If I could figure out how to get Congress to rewrite our tax code and do that, I think we should do that. Otherwise, all of the other rich countries spend more money on housing subsidies for poor people, whether that's building social housing, as France does, which they fund through a tax on major employers, or whether they provide cash directly to households, which a number of other countries do. We are very stingy in the amount of resources we spend on poor people, and that's why we have so many people without stable housing.
Hi, thanks. I'm Kevin Walker from Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative. One of the places, when I think about the levers to really move the scale of change that you're describing, when we're talking about 3 million homes short all over the country, it feels like what is broken is deeply structural. And a lot of it seems to be that, especially folks coming out of homelessness or housing instability, literally don't have any dollars to express their demand for a proper and decent place to live. And so it seems like the crux of the issue is fundamentally, and it goes exactly to what you just said, the country's apparent inability or political unwillingness to make broad-based, project-based rental assistance available. The fact that people have to sit on 8 or 10-year waiting lists to access project-based vouchers means that lots of units aren't getting built that would get built if that was around. One of the outcomes of this year's legislative session was we did see some progress. We saw the introduction of Bring It Home a new state-based, project-based rental assistance program. And I was wondering if you could speak to, on the national scale, what's the status of the conversation? There are other states that also run state-based, project-based rental assistance. It's hard to imagine anything coming out of this Congress or the next 6 that might address the question. So, it seems like if there's going to be initiative, it's going to happen at a state level. So could you give us a sense of what you're seeing around the country, and is there reason to be optimistic? Thanks.
I think you're 100% right that Congress is not going to get its act together on housing affordability in any time in the near future. And there hasn't honestly been that much appetite in either party to expand the direct budget for vouchers, for public housing. LIHTC is the only program that really has much broad-based support in Washington. There are a number of states that have relatively small state-level voucher programs. We are seeing more interest in that from new states, partly because the emergency rental assistance program worked really, really well. And a bunch of places that had never had local or state emergency rental assistance realized that, in fact, it's cheaper in the long run to keep people housed or to do eviction diversion and get people into housing than have them become homeless and then have to get them rehoused afterwards. So, I think that was a useful realization. The question is always, where does the money come from? For states and localities, you have limited financial tools. Increasing property taxes to pay for a local voucher program would be a great policy if your existing tax base is willing to vote for that. I will say that wealthy, progressive places are more willing to tax themselves and create funds than they are to do things like allow apartments to be built. So it's probably easier to get a stream of funding for that. But if you don't have apartments for people to move into, you're limited, right? So in a lot of the really tight markets, even if we gave more people vouchers, there aren't vacant units, or landlords aren't willing to take the vouchers. And so figuring out somehow, there's some technical tweaks to the voucher program to get more landlords involved. I love the idea that some places are giving people cash rather than vouchers so that it's easier for the landlord. You don't have to go through HUD's process. I think there were some efforts in Minneapolis to do a small sort of pilot program with giving people small amounts of cash. Those are great things for philanthropy to fund, because philanthropy is more flexible than public entities. Try funding universal basic assistance, emergency rental assistance, longer-term voucher programs, maybe at lower dollar values, but distributed across more people, and then see how those work, right? Build the case for having a bigger public allocation.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I think did you raise your hand? Kevin got it. Okay, one more. Way over there. Okay, coming your way. Getting my steps in today. Anyone else?
Thank you. Hi, thank you, Jenny. My name is Alvin with the Kepler Institute in Indianapolis, and really appreciate your thoughtful presentation. So I would like to know really 2 things. One is just a little bit about your personal story. What really interested you in the housing as an issue? And on a second part, how do you feel about where we're at right now? And then a second question, the issue of gentrification, particularly in predominantly Black and brown communities. Have you seen any ways or ideas for how to mitigate or combat that come to your mind?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So my housing affordability villain origin story. I got hired out of college by a company called Apt Associates to work in their public housing strategic consulting group. So this was at a time when housing authorities were being given more flexibility in what they could do, but also being asked to make decisions they hadn't made before. And I got sent around the country to lots of housing authorities, mostly that were in distress and trying to figure out what to do. And I was both appalled at how many people didn't have access to housing, and the Boston Housing Authority had a 15-year wait list, which was obviously not going to help many people. So I was frustrated by the extent of the problem, and also really interested that just the housing problems look really different in different cities and neighborhoods. And so it seemed like this is a big and important problem and something I really wanted to study. skipping to the question of sort of gentrification, one of the reasons why I really like the idea of doing broad-based city or even state level supply-oriented initiatives is that it gets beyond just allowing housing development in a small set of neighborhoods, right? So developers want to build in expensive places where rich people live because they can make more profit, right? So like you can sell higher priced and higher rental housing, and they would love to be able to build in expensive neighborhoods, but they can't. So they go just over the line to the next neighborhood that has a little bit less political resistance where they can build something. And often that winds up being moderate income Black and Latino communities that are adjacent to sort of the rich white areas. If we do a citywide zoning change or even a statewide one, then developers can do development in the richer neighborhoods where they're locked out. So, in some sense, the best way to prevent gentrification in poor and moderate income Black and brown neighborhoods is to build a ton of luxury housing in places that are already wealthy and white. And to do that, we're going to need these broad-based kind of zoning changes.
I think we have to wrap up, but thank you so much. Can we give Jenny and Danielle a round of applause, please? This was a really wonderful conversation. I just want to say thank you so much to both of you, and to just going off the cuff with questions that you didn't know what were going to come at you. We did not screen those, so thank you to all of you for your really thoughtful questions and your intentional curiosity about this topic. I know we talk a lot about how hard this problem is, and oftentimes, at least in the habitat circles, we talk about how we can't build our way out of this problem. And we often rely on this idea that the problem is too hard. And I have been telling other people that I'd love for us to reframe that narrative. I would really love for us to reframe the narrative to what would it take to actually solve the problem. And I'm feeling really optimistic that this group came together to have this very specific policy wonky conversation. And I'm thankful that you all are putting this thoughtful energy into this work, because we know that it matters, and it means that we can solve the problem. And so working together with the thought leadership in this room to consider and celebrate the $1 billion investment our state legislature passed last year, which is incredible and historic and amazing. And also, what do we need to do to get those houses built, and to be putting thoughtful leadership into that. So I'm feeling really optimistic about the future in Minnesota, and I just want to celebrate that as you think about what we do from here on out. Just the intellect and the nuggets of information that I hope that you take from today and put them into practice in your local communities and in your spheres of influence in the work that you do. So thank you again for being here. Thank you to Minnesota Coalition for Community Land Trust and Minnesota Housing Partnership for co-hosting this event with Habitat Minnesota. And a final thank you to all of our sponsors for making this event possible. I hope that you all enjoy the reception outdoor or out in the area and connecting with your colleagues about what you can do today to reframe the narrative and solve the affordable housing crisis in our state. Thank you so much.